Welcome back to our course on conflict of interest for professionals. In previous modules, we have defined conflicts of interest, discussed how to recognize them, discussed remedies to conflict of interest situations, and talked about disclosure. In this module, we will bring these issues together as we talk about creating conflict of interest policies. Conflict is no stranger to a courtroom. Thus, there are several legal issues you must bear in mind when writing conflict of interest policies. The first is that courts in Canada and other places which follow British common law often draw a distinction between the public and private sectors. In the private sectors, courts will allow dismissal only when an actual conflict of interest has been proven. In the public sector, though, the courts recognize the need for confidence in the civil service, to perceive the public service as impartial and effective in fulfilling its duties. Thus, they apply a more lenient rule and allow dismissal based only on apparent or perceived conflict of interest. A second legal issue is the standard of proof your policy will require. These cases must balance several issues. The first issue is that your policy must be understandable to be effective. You must avoid making it so complex or all-encompassing that your users cannot follow or understand it. Second, as we've discussed, you must balance disclosure requirements with the right to privacy. People should only be asked to disclose the bare minimum details of their private lives. And as the disclosed information becomes more and more sensitive, the onus on the organization increases to maintain the confidentiality of that information, to protect it from prying eyes. Lastly, there is a universal right to due process. If someone is going to be accused of a conflict of interest, a proper process must be followed that includes, at a minimum, a right to know the case against them and the right to put forward a rebuttal. These legal issues should be considered whenever drafting conflict of interest policies. When it comes to writing conflict of interest policies, there are two broad philosophies. The first is a minimum rule solution. These tend to be general documents describing conflict of interest with, as the name suggests, fewer rules. These policies emphasize the spirit of disclosure, relying on individual integrity to do the right thing. These policies also place a high value on privacy. The bare minimum information is required as disclosure, and what is disclosed is well protected. There are negatives to these policies, though. They tend to lack guidance, clarity, and certainty. This makes people less confident when they are dealing with them, that they are doing the right thing. The lack of publicly available information, due to the jealous guarding of disclosures, sometimes makes people suspect that there is a hidden conflict of interest. Lastly, the lack of rules makes it harder to prove conflicts when they arise. Thus, enforcement is more challenging. The opposite of the minimum rules solution is the codification solution. These documents tend to read more like laws. The detailed nature of these policies allows for greater clarity and certainty amongst the users. The greater disclosure requirements may increase public confidence through increased transparency. Lastly, their details provide standards for employees and perhaps even performance measurement tools. These policies do, however, erode privacy and the spirit of voluntary disclosure. They sometimes also lack flexibility and discretion to deal with unexpected nuances and circumstances. Their sometimes strict nature may even discourage potential employees from working for the organization. Finally, their overly specific rules often encourage people to find loopholes, which are inevitably there. In summary, then, neither the minimalist nor the codification solutions are perfect. I simply suggest you gravitate to the one that best suits your organization's culture. Having chosen a minimalist or codification solution, what should you put in your policy? What things should you discuss in the policy? Similar to many policies, a good conflict of interest policy should include discussions on purpose, application, effective and review dates, who will administer the policy, the responsible officer, definitions, any principles behind your policy, responsibilities, disclosures and how they will be handled, how conflicts of interest will be managed, and enforcement. You can, of course, add or delete sections for your own policy to match your organization's style. Let's expand on these sections. In the purpose section, you set out why you wrote the policy in the first place. Why did you bother? Looking at the Government of Canada, they say the goal of a conflict of interest policy is to eliminate conflicts of interest where possible, or alternatively, to identify and disclose real, potential, or perceived institutional conflicts of interest, to make them transparent and open to scrutiny, and to provide mechanisms to minimize or otherwise manage them. You also need to define to whom the policy applies. Remember, a good conflict of interest policy should recognize differences in the ability to impact decisions and limit its application to those people who make or significantly impact significant decisions. For example, going to Starbucks and deciding which coffee to buy does not count as a significant decision. Deciding which caterer will supply coffee at an international meeting with 5,000 delegates does count. And along the catering line, a secretary simply issuing the purchase order to implement your catering decision also does not count, as the secretary had no significant impact on the actual decision. Now, it's common for organizations to write policies and then forget about them. I'm sure if you work for a large organization, you've come across such policies. The policy was only a box that needed to be checked after all. If your conflict of interest policy is going to work, someone must oversee the policy, or else it will wither. In addition, that responsible officer must be given the resources, authority, and power they need to guide the policy. As we've seen in these modules, not all conflict of interest issues are clear-cut. Thus, you should define relevant terms. You should explain what you mean by such terms as actual, perceived, apparent, potential conflicts of interest, financial and personal interests, and disclosure. As well, you should use definitions that are relevant to your organization. You should also give examples of situations that you believe are not conflicts. Things like the arbitrator's green list, for example, that we discussed in the previous module. Now, do's and don'ts only go so far. In the middle ground, it is good to state principles people can use to decide these in-between issues. Some common principles are establishing a preference to avoiding conflicts if possible, rather than trying to manage them. That all conflicts of interest are to be managed transparently, within the constraints of due process and privacy. emphasizing the joint involvement of staff, managers, and the organization itself in all conflict of interest issues, and establishing a balance between full disclosure and the right to privacy. You should feel free to modify these principles or add any other principles that you feel are appropriate to your situation. Your policy should lay out who is responsible for what. For instance, a simple list of responsibilities may say that staff must be aware of their obligation to avoid conflicts of interest where possible and manage those they cannot avoid. Assess their private interest to determine whether they conflict or may conflict in the future, and appropriately disclose any conflicts of interest, whether real, perceived, or potential. The organization, on the other hand, may be required to establish and review a conflict of interest policy. Build a culture of integrity where disclosure and dealing with conflict of interest is paramount. And, recognizing the gray nature of many conflict of interest issues, the organization should have the responsibility to provide resources where staff can go for advice, preferentially confidential advice. And lastly, the organization should be responsible to investigate complaints of conflict of interest, rather than just brush them under the carpet. Lastly, managers may be required to be aware of the risks of conflicts inherent in their staff's work, to train their staff in the appropriate policy and procedures, to appropriately record any disclosures and advise staff about how to manage conflicts, to help staff disclose conflicts, and to monitor their staff and the risks to which they are exposed. These are all just suggestions. Your policy should identify responsibilities that are relevant to your circumstances. As you know, the last module was devoted to disclosure, so it should be a major focus of your policy. You should discuss such things as which interest should be disclosed, when to disclose an interest, including procedures to disclose future interests, to whom to disclose the interests, details of how to disclose an interest. Such details may include going over any specific form you may have, an assurance that all disclosures will be treated confidentially, and where to go for support or to ask questions. This latter point is especially important, as conflict of interest is often not black and white. When we talk about providing support for staff dealing with conflict of interest, who do we mean? Going back to our study of developed countries, we see that supervisors are the almost universal choice. But there is an assumption here. What is that? The assumption is that the supervisor knows enough about conflict of interest and any policies to give informed advice. For those of you who are supervisors, do you feel that you know enough about conflict of interest to be such an advisor? Would you feel that your current supervisor has the required knowledge? Moving down the list, we have dedicated people inside or outside the organization. This may be a conflict of interest commissioner, an ethics commissioner, human resource departments, etc. Several companies have even established telephone help desks. And now we get to the meat of the policy. What to do with a conflict of interest when it arises. We have discussed using the 6 R's. Register the interests, reassign the conflicted person, recruit an independent person, replace the conflicted person. Relinquish whatever issue or situation is causing the conflict, and resignation. But the 6 R's is just an example of how to handle conflict of interest. You should manage conflicts in a way that suits your organization. Having managed the conflict, you should pay attention to record keeping for legal and human resource purposes. And as the records often involve private information, you should have a definite time at which the records are destroyed. Now, we all know that not everyone follows the rules, so your policy should discuss enforcement. You'll also need to balance discipline versus training and support. As an example of such a balance, we have PepsiCo's conflict of interest policy that says if a conflict of interest exists and there is no failure of good faith on the part of the employee, it will be PepsiCo's policy to allow a reasonable amount of time for the employee to correct the situation. This policy includes the implied recognition that conflict of interest can be innocent and the ability for the person to fix the situation. Now that you have written everything down, how do you implement it? First off, follow any implementation precedents your organization has used for previous policies. There are also implementation checklists you can employ, which include such things as whether all managers and staff have received adequate training in how to manage conflicts of interest, whether someone has been appointed as the responsible officer, whether you've highlighted examples of effectively managed conflicts of interest, whether conflicts of interest mechanisms in contracting and tendering processes are being effectively managed, and whether there is a defined process to capture staff and managers' feedback and complaints. The Participants Guide has a more complete implementation checklist for those who want to use one. I would like to close this module with a case study looking at an actual conflict of interest policy. Now, there are many to choose from. Some are very, very short. Others, like the federal government, are very long and complex. For this case study, I chose the Nova Scotia Conflict of Interest Policy for two reasons. One, I used to work for the Nova Scotia government, and I'm thus somewhat familiar with the policy. And two, it strikes a middle ground between too short and simple and overly long and complex. Now, you can see the full policy in the appendix to the Participants Guide. And I encourage you at this time to read the policy before we embark on our discussion. Now, earlier, I listed suggested core elements of conflict of interest policy. These include purpose, application, effective and review dates, who will administer the policy, definitions, principles behind your policy, responsibilities, disclosures and how they will be handled, managing conflicts of interest, and enforcement. Let's go through these and see how Nova Scotia stacks up. I will note that conflict of interest is a complex topic, as I've said before, and this review is not to be a critique of the ethical choices Nova Scotia has made. It is more to check to see whether various issues are discussed in reasonable detail. The first element is purpose. Does the policy discuss its intent? In the Nova Scotia policy, this is actually in the first paragraph, where it says, this policy is intended to reduce the potential for conflict of interest within Nova Scotia's public service by defining conflict of interest and by providing tools to address situations that arise when an employee's personal and employment interests conflict. So, purpose, check. The next element is application. To whom does the policy apply? This is an especially complex question in governments, where we have line departments, agencies, crown corporations, etc., etc. In the Nova Scotia policy, this actually comes in on page 2, where it says the policy applies to all employees whose terms and conditions are set out in accordance with both the Civil Service Act and its regulations and other direct employees of the provincial government, including all bargaining unit employees. So a bit complex, and you do need to know who is covered by the Civil Service Act. Not the most straightforward piece of legislation. So, for application, I give it a bit lower score. Now, does the policy say when it comes into force and when it will be reviewed? Well, yes and no. The effective date is clear, May 15, 2009, as listed at the bottom of the last page. But as for review dates, we have a vague statement under monitoring. The public service will be responsible for monitoring the effectiveness and consistent application of this policy. No dates or even a clear requirement to review the policy. So once more, I give it a bit lower score. The policy is clear on who is responsible for its implementation. As it says under monitoring, the Public Service Commission will be responsible for monitoring the effectiveness and consistent application of this policy. So, full marks. The policy does have definitions, including conflict of interest, including defining real and apparent conflict of interest, while noting potential conflicts. Deputy head, departments, employee are all defined. It also defines private interest, although that is in a footnote, and that only states what is not a private interest. Are there any definitions that are missing? Well, I would say interest would be a good definition, especially since we spent a whole module discussing the topic. So, only partial marks. Nova Scotia policy is strong on principles, stating Nova Scotia employees recognize conflict of interest undermines the confidence of the public and that of elected officials. Place the trust and confidence of our citizens and elected officials in the highest regard and work to foster a reputation of carrying out and being a caring and professional public service. Must be impartial and accountable and treat all citizens in all matters with respect, integrity, and fairness, etc., etc., etc. So, back to full marks. As to responsibilities, beyond establishing responsibilities throughout the document, there is a specific section, starting on page 41, that includes responsibilities for employees, deputy head, head of the public service, conflict of interest commissioner, and the Public Service Commission. Once again, full marks. I will note there is a disclosure section on page 38, but all it says is, employees who have a conflict of interest, real, apparent, or perceived, must provide a confidential report to the supervisor outlining the nature of the conflict. Employees will refer to the Conflict of Interest Act where they find themselves in a situation in which a conflict of interest exists. The Act reads, where a public employee is at a meeting at which consideration of a decision arises in the execution of the office of the public employee and whether the public employee knows or ought to know that the decision will result in the public employee receiving a personal benefit, the public employee shall inform the meeting that the decision could result in a personal benefit to the public employee and the general nature of the benefit, withdraw from the meeting and refrain from participating in or influencing the decision. And that's it. No discussion of how to disclose or the nuances of disclosure. Again, a topic upon which we spent an entire module. The disclosure section also does not discuss confidentiality. While there is a confidentiality section on page 41, that section is vague, as well as being 3 pages away. Sorry, Nova Scotia, a fail. The Nova Scotia policy concentrates on preventing conflict of interest. There is no talk of unavoidable conflict of interest or how to manage conflicts. The policy also refers to another document, Values, Ethics, and Conflicts, a code for Nova Scotia's public servants. But this pamphlet only discusses public service values, not how to deal with conflict of interest. In the end, managing conflicts of interest is left to the implied authority of the deputy head, with no guidance as to how to actually manage them. Once again, sorry, Nova Scotia. And now our last core element, enforcement. While short, the Nova Scotia policy does say an employee who fails to comply with this policy is subject to appropriate disciplinary action up to and including discharge. Short, but what else do you want it to say? So we close on a high note and conclude that, overall, the Nova Scotia policy has pluses and minuses. Now, this case study was not to beat up on Nova Scotia. It was meant to show that you can review any conflict of interest policy, including your own, to see how it stacks up against preset criteria. With those reviews letting you focus in on the areas of most importance. And that concludes our discussion of conflict of interest policies. I invite you now to move on to Module 9, where we will discuss some issues associated with conflict of interest.